if you see a building that's on fire, well, what do? Right? The first thing you do is you call the firefighters. They sprinkle water over it. That's what you do first, and then you start thinking about all the other problems. And that's also how I think about poverty. I mean, poverty just makes everything worse. There's even evidence that it impedes your cognitive ability. It impedes your ability to think in the long term, to make plans for the future, and sure, there will always be some people who will waste their basic income, but usually when it comes to richer people, we're not worried about that. We just call it venture capital, and we say, "Oh, sure, go on and and experiment, try new things." And yes, we should consider basic income as venture capital for the people.
What could go right? I'm Zachary Karabell, the founder of the Progress Network, and I am joined in our fourth season, as in our previous 3 seasons, by Emma Varvaloucas, the executive director of the Progress Network. And we have been, over the past couple of years, been having a series of conversations with people who we think are compelling figures focused on how we solve our collective problems. Doesn't mean that they are not acutely attuned to those. It doesn't mean that everybody we talk to is cheery and wakes up with a smile on their face about all the daisies and lilies and chirping birds. It just means that they are, in their way, embracing a sensibility that is not plunging us into despair, but is instead trying to lift us into a collective future that we want to live in. This is a belief that we have, and I know I'm being repetitive for those of you who've been listening to some of these, but I want to be repetitive in that creating a collective sensibility of how we go forward into a future of our hopes, not a future of our fears, is an ongoing work that is more about lots of individuals coming together and lots of organizations coming together. The Progress Network is a collection of individuals, and increasingly, we hope, also a network of networks. So it is trying to build critical mass, or be one of many voices in a critical mass that we believe is an essential component to solving problems and creating that future, and that there's some historical precedent for when societies believe that they are able to solve problems, they're more able to solve them than when they're convinced that they can. So in that spirit, we're having these conversations, and our first interview of the season, Emma will tell you about who he is, but I think in many ways is the perfect iteration of some of these themes that I just attempted to highlight. So Emma, tell us who we are speaking with today.
Today, we're going to talk to Rutger Bregman, who's a historian and an author. He's published 5 books on history, philosophy, and economics, and you may recognize 2 of them because they were New York Times bestsellers, Humankind and Utopia for Realists. Those have been translated into more than 40 languages. Bregman has also been twice nominated for the prestigious European Press Prize for his work at The Correspondent, which is an online platform he founded that's dedicated to constructive and ad-free journalism.
Rutger Bregman, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you as well for being part of the Progress Network. As you know, and just we continue to reiterate this because these are themes that we feel need reiteration. We're trying to focus on a world of problems solved, and not a world of problems endlessly created or endlessly dwelt upon, but not some sort of rose-tinted, Pollyannish, Voltaire, we live in the best of all possible worlds, more of the only way that we will ever live in a world that is even close to the best of all possible worlds is by focusing on our collective ability to create that world. Full stop.
I really love that. Thanks for having me.
You've been doing some, I think, quite compelling work over the past decade plus. A little bit of it in Dutch, which I'm, making my way through really slowly, word by word. But the English translations of Utopia and of Humankind, I think, have struck some real resonance around the world, particularly the latest book. And maybe you can talk a little bit about how you sort of came to, because you're both edgy, right? You're certainly not without critique of the systems that we exist in. But you're also hopeful. So maybe as a kind of a delve into Rutger's personality for a moment, how do you square the edgy with the hopeful?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that if you go back in history, progressive used to be quite hopeful, actually. If you think about something like scientific progress, that used to be something that progressives were very excited about. But something happened along the way, is that when we think about technology today, it's mainly doom and gloom that dominates the conversation. And sure, there are some good reasons for that. But as a historian, I always love to point out that, yeah, we have made extraordinary progress. And it's very easy to lose sight of that, especially if you live in an incredibly rich country. I mean, here in the Netherlands, I recently looked this up. If you have a median wage, you are part of the 3.5 richest in the world, right? We have access to riches that, even the King of France in the 17th century couldn't dream of. So I think it's really important to have that perspective. And in my work, I've always been interested in the phenomenon of how seemingly unrealistic things can become reality. How do we move from utopia to reality? How do we actually make the impossible happen? And that's been fun over the years to focus on that question.
I wanted to drill in a little bit into that question of how we do exactly make the impossible happen, when it comes to incentivizing human behavior. And I think, people have different theories about that. One that I picked up in your work, fairly recently, because you've been a proponent of effective altruism, and I see this theme coming up in your work generally, is the role of shame, right? And it was really interesting for me to encounter that in your work, because for me, shame seems like the worst kind of incentivizer, right? I feel like it shuts people down, doesn't give them an off-ramp for their behavior. No one likes to feel ashamed. But I think you have the opposite perspective. So I would be really curious to hear your case for why shame is a good incentivizer of human behavior, or a useful one.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I really think that shame is a quite useful tool, actually. We are pretty much the only species in the whole animal kingdom with the ability to blush, which is, I think, a fascinating and telling fact, that we involuntarily give away our feelings to other members of our species. And that basically helps to establish trust between one another. I think it's also very disturbing when people are not able to blush anymore. I mean, that's sometimes true when we think about some of our leaders, right? Think of your favorite politician and then think of the last time you saw him or her blush. It's probably a very long time ago. So, I think that shame can sometimes push people in the right directions. So I'll give you a couple of examples from my personal life. I recently turned vegan, and it was actually because of my mother, who she's 65 years old, and she'd been eating cheese her whole life. But then she encountered the arguments against the exploitation of cows and calves. And she was like, okay, I'll stop doing that. And then she called me up and she said, Rutger, you pretend to be this, this idealistic author. And I see you going on about all these things on television, but you haven't even turned vegan yourself yet. So my mother is very good at shaming me. And that was actually quite effective. So now I've turned vegan as well. I often think that it can be a quite powerful tool.
It's so funny you bring up the veganism example, because and I don't mean to insult you in any way. When I think of vegans, I constantly think of them being self-righteous and telling me like, why aren't you vegan? Why aren't you vegan? And for me personally, it shuts me down. But then again, my mom has never called me up and made that argument. So maybe that's the difference there.
Yeah. Look, my philosophy would be just whatever works. I think in general, people are often more motivated by, I don't know, the excitement of doing things better. So in the case of effective altruism, for example, it's interesting. You had the philosopher Peter Singer, who already in the 70s published a seminal paper about children drowning in a pond, and that people dying in Africa from, say, malaria is the morally similar, and that we have an obligation to help people very far away. It takes like $4,000 or $5,000 to save one life, according to the think tank GiveWell. But that guilt framing of the argument didn't resonate all that much. I mean, Peter Singer was basically on his own for decades, donating half of his salary. People are like, "Oh, that's interesting, Peter, that you're doing that, but we don't really do that. We're not like that." And then effective altruism came along, this movement of people, very rational people who know how to improve the world, and they came up with a different framing. Like, it's actually pretty exciting to do good, and to do good in a really effective way. Now, I do have some problems with that movement, especially lately. But I think the fact that they build a whole movement around this excitement, the opportunity framing of there's just so much you can do, especially if you do it collectively, is in the end more effective. So, I see your argument that there are real limits to the power of shame as well.
All right, so let's pick up on that, given that it's a provocative topic about not just the specific particular crisis that some of the backers of effective altruism had, particularly in the form of the crypto money and Sam Bankman-Fried, and the money that had gone into effective altruism. Altruism as a movement precedes the money, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then the ideas attracted the money. There is I would say, fraught relationship, right, between the idealism that a lot of people have and a capitalist system that also requires the funding of ideas, right? I mean, ideas, we don't live in a world that we lived in a few hundred years ago, where there were sort of separate silos between, let's say, ideas, money, power. Right? Those things tend to commingle in today's world. And if you think about technology and the people who the initial wave of kind of utopian fervor in Silicon Valley in the 90s and into the early 2000s, whether it's Google, don't be evil, or whether it's, we're going to get rich and change the world. And we look at that rather cynically now as, give me a break. You're just telling yourself a story of pablum in order to make yourself feel better about your billions. But these things clearly are intertwined. And I'm wondering how, separate from the obvious critiques of sort of pure venality and pure hypocrisy, how one navigates we do live in a world where the more currency ideas have, right, the more backing they have, the more potent they can be, which requires money.
Yes. Look, I think this has always been an issue. I was recently reading a lecture that Ralph Nader, the great consumer advocate, gave in the 60s, 1968, November, at Harvard Law School. And his message to the students back then was basically, you're about to waste your whole career. You're about to waste your life, because you're probably going to work for some stupid law firm helping big corporations to sell crap to consumers. That's basically what's probably going to happen. But yeah, there is a small chance that you may choose a different direction. And then there was this group of Nader's raiders. We've all forgotten about this, obviously, because Nader, did some not very smart things around the 2000 election. But what he did in the 60s and 70s was extremely impressive. So many young people. At some point, a third of Harvard Law School applied to work with him to basically fight the good fight. So think, for example, of the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. I mean, the Clean Air Act has saved millions of lives. And the fingerprints of Ralph Nader's students are all over it. So, but this has always been an issue. It's basically often easier to earn a lot of money while you're not contributing all that much, and vice versa. I mean, it's not always true, but it is quite often true. That doesn't mean that you should be, how do you say that? As an idealist, you should not be afraid of money or anything like that. If we think of the great movements in history, whether it's abolitionism or the women's rights movement or the climate movement, very often there were very wealthy philanthropists who played a very important role in that. Actually, I was recently studying the invention of the birth control pill, which was actually financed by a suffragette and a feminist named Catherine McCormick, right? She supplied the money that made this incredibly important, maybe one of the most important inventions in all of world history, right? It liberated women basically and allowed them to control their own fertility. So you don't have to be afraid of money in that respect. But it's often a dilemma, I guess, for young idealistic people, in which when they're thinking about the rest of their lives.
The problem being that you have to be involved in some potentially shady stuff to get the money. It's very hard to be a do-gooder and make money at the same time. But, Rutger, as I was listening to you speak, I started thinking about like maybe Nader is a great proponent of the excitement principle that you were talking about. Like if we get people excited about, the change that we can make, we can get them on board. And then I started thinking about you as a proponent of the excitement principle around taxes, which also relates to this discussion of money that we've been having. And I know that we've had some progress recently in the EU. I'm in Greece, you're in the Netherlands, around the 15% minimum corporate tax rate. So I'm wondering if you can give us, your exciting explanation of what's happening right now with taxes and, if we're going anywhere at all with that.
Of course, yes. Not many people know this, but we're actually making progress in the fight against tax evasion and tax avoidance. There's some pretty good news to share. So in 2019, I was invited to Davos and said some things that they didn't like, and they haven't invited me back. But since then, if I just look at my own country, the Netherlands, it used to be a huge tax paradise. Especially US corporations had stashed hundreds of billions of dollars in the Netherlands, tax-free. And that's basically gone right now. The amount of money that goes through the Netherlands towards, say, Bermuda or the Cayman Islands has been diminished completely, like the decline of 85% in the last 3 years. Same is happening on the European level, as you mentioned, we've just basically agreed to a 50% minimum corporate tax. And what's now going to happen is that other countries are going to follow. It's going to be a domino effect. Because if they don't do that, then for at least profits that corporations will make in Europe, we'll do it ourselves. So if the US doesn't properly implement this minimum corporate tax, it's basically stealing from US taxpayers, or it's basically giving the money to European taxpayers in that way, because we'll just stop it up. And that's some real progress there, because there has been more transparency and some great advocacy by experts like, for example, Gabriel Zucman or Thomas Piketty, etc. So this is a funny phenomenon that very often when we start to get angry about something, when something starts to get exposed, that's the exact moment when we're already making progress. And it's when no one's talking about something. Like tax evasion 20 years ago, no one was really thinking about that. That wasn't a big issue. And that was actually when it was at its worst. So that's often with the news, right? It completely deludes you about what's actually going on and what the real direction of history actually is.
Part of the challenge, and I know you mentioned off air that you're writing a new book about the rise of the abolitionist movement. So I've always had a personal negative reaction to true believers of any stripe, even while I recognize that a certain kind of radical true belief often drives history and penetrates or forces a break in the status quo. Nader's a good example of that. Some of the abolitionists were clearly a good example of that. These were people who were morally black and white, and that drove their passion in a way that was probably necessary in order to end something, that was sort of morally unambiguously wrong. That being said, people like Piketty and people like Zucman have a certain black and white view of wealth, taxes in the state that I feel, and I'd like your reaction to this. So what it misses is the other side of the ledger, which is it's one thing to say that there should be a more equitable that we should all pay for the commons, essentially, and that we have a responsibility to each other. The challenge that I think is legitimate and is often phrased on the right is the institutions that we have created, the government institutions we've created that are supposed to create that equity, are often, at least outside of Northern Europe, woefully incompetent and often venal and corrupt themselves. So you substitute one level of corruption, which is I'm not going to pay for the commons, with another level of either incompetence or corruption, which is we're going to take your money and we're actually not going to do a very good job taking care of the commons. So like kind of what I feel like both sides of that ledger are essential. And one of the Northern Europe is one of the few, the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, Singapore, Taiwan, there are few examples of countries that seem to get this more right than not, but there are a whole lot more examples of countries that don't get this right at all.
Yeah. I see that point. Look, I think that quite often on the left, there's a lot of talk about wealth redistribution, which is important, but not enough talk about wealth creation, right? Who are the actual wealth creators? And in that respect, what I've been trying to do with my work is to reframe that question, sometimes to basically just say, look, the real wealth creators are often the maintainers, the teachers, the nurses, the care workers, or those who have these so-called essential jobs, as we've come to call them during the pandemic. But yeah, it's also about the innovators, about the people who come up with new, amazing solutions to our problems. And that's something that, I mean, Ezra Klein recently wrote this in the New York Times, is that too often the right can only look nostalgically to the past, and then the left is completely focused on the injustices of the present. But who actually has the courage to look forward? And this has been a frustration I have for a very long time, actually, since the beginning of my career as a writer, is that so often people only know what they're against, right? They're against the establishment, against racism, against homophobia, against everything, basically. There was even a book published a couple of years ago by a major left-wing intellectual called Against Everything. And what was the first chapter? Against exercise, I think. Well, sure, I'm against exercise as well, or at least I don't particularly enjoy it. But at some point, you also got to think about, what are you actually for? What do you want to create? And yeah, I guess that is a spirit that can transcend the traditional divide between the left and the right, which you can see actually in many of these movements that you just mentioned. I've come to call it moral ambition, the yearning and the drive to create a better world and to make an impact. And the most exciting thing about that is that it's contagious. This drive, it's not about your genetics, it's not about your biology, it's not who you are fundamentally as a person. No, it's an idea, and you can be infected with that idea. It's something that Tyler Cowen, the economist, said once, that one of the greatest things or most worthwhile things you can do with your life is to basically increase other people's ambition. And I've never forgot that remark, and I've been trying to do that ever since, basically trying to raise other people's levels of ambition. Like whenever they said, I have this plan, I said, well, do that, but top it up 50% or something like that. Yeah, I sometimes miss that spirit among my friends on the left.
I feel like, I'm kind of doing like a top line view of your greatest hits here, Rutger, but obviously you've done a lot of work on, you've done a lot of work on UBI, Universal Basic Income. And, I was thinking, as Zachary was talking about, some of the common narratives on the left, and you were talking about some common narratives on the left. Another narrative is that if there was just enough money, everything would be fine. Like everything can be solved by money. And I feel like sometimes with UBI, like my personal hesitation around it is that it seems to be presented as a silver bullet, like that certainly there are some people whose problems are caused by money, and if they had more money, the problems would be solved. But there are also people in poverty whose problems are not primarily coming from money, right? If you talk to any person suffering from addiction, they could tell you that money is not going to solve that problem. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, because you have that famous phrase, poverty isn't a lack of character, it's a lack of cash. And I was wondering if you thought about this hesitation I've brought up, which I'm sure you have.
Sure, yeah. So obviously poverty is not the only problem in people's lives, right? But if you see a building that's on fire, well, what do? Right? The first thing you do is you call the firefighters. They sprinkle water over it. That's what you do first, and then you start thinking about all the other problems. And that's also how I think about poverty. I mean, poverty just makes everything worse. There's even evidence that it impedes your cognitive ability. It impedes your ability to think in the long term, to make plans for the future. And sure, there will always be some people who will waste their basic income. But usually when it comes to richer people, we're not worried about that. We just call it venture capital. And we say, oh, sure, go on and experiment, try new things. And yes, we should consider basic income as venture capital for the people. I think in general, it will be a pretty great investment. And especially when it comes to poverty, there's a lot of evidence that it actually costs us more money. Poverty is it's just too expensive. We can't really afford it. That's what I always believe. Whenever I'm, say, San Francisco or Los Angeles, I'm always astonished to see so many homeless people on the streets. And what I see there is just an extraordinary waste of human capital. I mean, so many people who could have fulfilling lives and who could go on and contribute to the common good. But there they are. I mean, we have a homeless population in the Netherlands here as well, but you would have to walk around for hours in Amsterdam to see as many homeless people as you see in 5 minutes in San Francisco, probably.
But this gets back to something I was saying earlier, which is, particularly in those cities, San Francisco and Los Angeles, the issue is actually not a lack of cash that's being spent to try to ameliorate the problem. It's the way the cash is being spent to try to ameliorate the problem. I mean, there's some statistic which I don't have offhand, but like the amount of money that it costs to build a quote unquote affordable housing unit in Los Angeles is just, mind boggling in terms of the hundreds or, I don't know if it's millions, but it's far more than it would cost to sort of rent every single person who's on the streets a room at a hotel, and that's, that's a systemic issue of, and the United States, I think, is unusual in this systemic issue, right? It's an extraordinary affluent society, no matter what its issues are, right? It is in aggregate an extraordinary affluent society that often spends money publicly in ways that are mind-bogglingly stupid. As opposed to not spending the money at all.
The hypocrisy is astounding as well, right? We've all read the Time to Build essay by Mark Andreessen, and I actually love that piece. And let's build. And then you hear that this is the guy who basically he's spending a lot of money to lobby for no construction in his own neighborhood.
Right.
And I don't want to dunk on Mark Andreessen specifically, because maybe we're like that as well. I mean, this NIMBYism is rampant.
NIMBY's been replaced by banana. Have you heard the new?
Oh no, I haven't heard that.
Banana.
What is that?
If NIMBY is not in my backyard, banana is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone.
I haven't heard that either.
I like that. Yeah. There's a really great book by Paul Sabin called Public Citizens about what happened in the US, basically since the 60s and the 70s, and about also how how progressives, and specifically progressive lawyers, contributed to this. So the book is, that's why I earlier mentioned Ralph Nader. It's mostly about Ralph Nader, and obviously this consumers movement, or public advocacy movement, had a lot of victories, did a lot of good, but then also created a huge amount of regulations, for example, environmental regulations, that are now being used to block efforts to do something about climate change. It's very, very ironical, and that's a real big problem, specifically in the United States. You guys just have way too many lawyers, man. Too many lawyers. If you're young and if you're ambitious and you want to do something, I mean, the stupidest thing you can do is to go to Harvard Law School. Don't go there. Don't do it. I mean, do something useful, please. There are just way too many people with the legal mindset. And again, the numbers here are astonishing. 5 of the 10 last presidents went to law school. 1/3 of the House of Representatives. Half of the Senate. What's going on there, right? These are all people who have been schooled in procedures, in rules, in regulations. They know how to say no. They know how to stop things from happening. And you basically have a whole class of NIMBYs or bananas. It's like the banana class. So that seems like a big problem to me. I don't know. There should be some kind of law against lawyers.
Rutger, I do have one personal example that might cheer you up a bit. My brother-in-law went to Yale Law School and now works on affordable housing in New York City. So there is at least one lawyer out there who's doing the opposite. Shout out to Roger.
Sure, they're not all bad. And look, every movement, there's so many different roles to play in every movement, right? And it's not enough just to shout on the sidelines or to occupy things. Which is necessary as well. I think we need the Extinction Rebellions as well, but we also need people with the what's it called, like an acceptance of plodding. Is that a word? That you're just willing to do the homework and to know the nitty gritty and all the bureaucratic details.
The blocking and tackling about there are people who just have to do the work. As we wrap up, I wanted to maybe have you highlight a little, because it's very much in the spirit of the Progress Network, this idea of uh, maybe infectious utopianism or
Hmm.
infectious idealism in a world where partly why I created this collective is the feeling that we were essentially, we being Western culture, but in many ways, uh, one of the downsides of the pandemic, of which there were many, is it kind of plunged everybody everywhere into a kind of collective gloom. Like
Hmm.
there used to be some sort of bifurcation between the gloom in the Western world and the optimism of China or India or elsewhere, and I
Hmm.
still think that's probably a little more prominent there. But we're
Hmm.
kind of in a doom scrolling cycle, not
Hmm.
a idealism cycle.
Yeah.
And I wonder, when you look at Europe now, for instance, post Brexit with Ukraine, uh, when you look around the world, do you find that you are kind of a la your early abolitionists, a lone voice crying in the wilderness, waiting for a change that you may or may not live to see, or do you feel like there is in fact a thaw in the global freeze of pessimism?
I think there's been a massive change in the zeitgeist. I've recently went to my old student society where I was a member 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, and I was astounded by the difference. I mean, kids, at least here in the Netherlands, are way more idealistic than we were just 10, 15 years ago. Um, when it comes to climate, when it comes to inequality, when it comes to the way we treat animals, so much more awareness. So I think that's real progress. And as you said, that can be infectious. I recently wrote a small essay about the psychology of resistance fighters during the Second World War. I was really interested in that question. Like what determined why some people had the courage to hide Jews and most others didn't. And it turns out that there isn't such a thing as the psychology of the resistance hero. There just isn't. It's a complete cross section of the population: men, women, young, old, rich, poor, educated, not educated. It's just you can't say anything about that. But there is a sociology of resistance. It turns out that it was highly infectious, and around 96% of people who were asked to join the resistance said yes. And that often it started with something small, like you didn't, salute, you didn't bring the Hitler greeting, or you did something small, you brought around an illegal newspaper or something like that, and then it started growing. And then I read another study about the origins of the British Industrial Revolution. You've probably seen this one by the historian Anthony Howes, if I pronounce that correctly. He studied, what is it, like the biographies of 1,700 inventors who played a really important role in the 1700s and the 1800s. And he basically came to the same conclusion. There wasn't really a psychology of the inventor, but there was a sociology. And the sociology was that it was infectious. Like all these important inventors, they knew someone who had also come up with something new. So they got the idea from somewhere that you don't have to keep doing the way you've always done them, right? You can change it. He calls this the improving mentality. And I think that this idea that there's no such thing as a psychology, but it's more like sociology, I think that's so liberating, right? You don't have to be this great person that you've always been ever, since high school or whatever. No, you can be infected by the idea of improving the world and playing your part and being morally ambitious. And what I see and what I would like to contribute to is that virus spreading further. And I think that's what you guys are also doing. So thanks for your work.
Yeah, this is like the Rutger Bregman, the generous meme instead of Richard Dawkins, the selfish meme, or like the utopian meme or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
So Rutger, as we totally come to an end here, do you just want to give us an overview of what you're working on now?
Sure, yeah. So as a historian, I've always been really interested in this question. What does it mean to stand on the right side of history? We can look back on the suffragettes, on the abolitionists, and we're very impressed with their courage and their fight in the face of all this evil, and we know the tremendous price that they often had to pay for their activism and for their courage. And then I wonder, who are the abolitionists of today? Who are the people that are now being dismissed as utopians, idiots, or maybe even dangerous activists, but who will be seen by the historians of the future as the heroes? So that's the focus of my next book. I'm interested in, well, what actually made the abolitionists effective. I mean, Zachary, you mentioned that they were, very, very idealistic, but I was actually surprised by how pragmatic they were as well. Extremely pragmatic, actually. For example, Thomas Clarkson, one of the main British abolitionists, he was really good at what they call moral reframing. Basically used different arguments to defend the same idea. So, for example, with the abolition of the slave trade, which he was arguing for, you would guess that they would mainly say, look, the slave trade is horrible because there are so many human beings suffering incredibly, right? So many Africans who are being tortured, blah, blah, blah. That's what we would assume that the abolitionists said. But actually, they focused on a different kind of argument, especially in British Parliament. Thomas Clarkson discovered that around 20% of the white sailors died during the voyage. The white sailors, actually the perpetrators. And then Thomas Clarkson realized that that would be a much more powerful political argument in Parliament to use. Now, for us, that's pretty bizarre, right? That they mainly use that argument. But it was super effective. It was one of the reasons why the prime minister at the time was like, oh, now I understand. This slave trade is really bad. 20% of our guys are dying on these voyages. That's horrific. So I think that is a really powerful lesson, that in the fight against injustice, winning is our duty, right? It's really important to get these actual results. And that makes the case of the British abolitionists really interesting, because they were super idealistic, that's true, but they were very pragmatic as well. They wanted to win.
Well, I look forward to seeing that arise, and I guess the next couple of years, right? We'll keep.
Yeah, we'll take some time. It's a lot of work writing a book.
Yeah, it's true. Anyway, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts and your work, and for being part of the Progress Network. And we will, I hope, continue these conversations over the next months and years.
Thanks so much for having me.
Emma, that was a provocative conversation with a unusual soul. I certainly like this idea, and of course we would like this idea of ideas being infectious, ideas being something that build to a critical mass and then suddenly spreads like wildfire in a way that isn't always expected and not always predictable, and then there you have it, which means that a certain climate of unremitting gloom can suddenly give way to something else. And I like the fact that someone who has a critical and progressive, different from the Progress Network, progressive in kind of the left sense of the word progressive, is not, as Rutger talked about, necessarily purely focusing on problems and what they're against.
Yeah, he is definitely a rare bird in that way. Most people, when they think about the left, they think about the unrelenting focus on all the bad things we need to fix. So he's rare, and I feel like he also comes to things with a real cheerfulness of demeanor. Sometimes you meet people, and okay, I never met Peter Singer personally, but sometimes you meet people and they have infectious ideas to share with a demeanor that doesn't match. But Rutger is I don't know, you understand why he's been so popular and his ideas have caught on, because I think he just really approaches them with this kind of enthusiasm for wanting to do good. And I think he's right, too, that the zeitgeist has started to change around that. I think I've seen it in the last couple of years that we've launched the Progress Network.
You and I did an interview, and I can't remember who it was with a podcast team that was, let's say, younger. And I remember with them at least, some of our attempts to talk about things in a more, not optimistic, but the kind of the way that we're trying to talk about things in the Patois of the Progress Network, right? Like more problem solving, more focus on what's working, more focus on things that are kind of better than we think. That struck a really difficult note with them. They were almost angry and felt, again, that somehow that focus was undermining the urgency of how bad things are. And it would be great to juxtapose the conversation we just had with that sensibility as a way of saying you can simultaneously be urgent about things that are systemically broken, and not be completely despairing and dyspeptic.
Yeah, and just keeping perspective, right? Like it's remarkable how quickly our perspective starts to warp, just depending, like what Rutger was talking about. If you make median wage, I think he's talked specifically about the Netherlands, you're in the top 3.5% of wealth in the world, right? Like, wow. That means, I think he points out that you have a lot of responsibility, and it's crazy that you could be in that position in the Europe or US or elsewhere and simultaneously adopt this attitude of almost constant complaint that you see sometimes on the left. And I say that with love. I don't say that to take anyone down, but it's fascinating how those two things can coexist.
So shall we turn to what's going on in the world?
Let's do it. Okay, so our first piece of news that we have for today is actually from a couple months ago, but I think it really passed under the radar, and it has to do with a conversation that we had with Rutger about the power of money. Congress, in a bipartisan fashion, actually voted to increase funding to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Saw its funding from the U.S. grow from 1.6 billion to 2 billion. That's more than 28% year over year boost. And what's cool about that is because of the way the fund operates, if the US pledges more money, the other countries in the fund are also kind of forced to pledge more money, which just means more money going into something that has been proven to work pretty well. The Global Fund says something like 50 million lives saved over the last, I think, maybe 30 years. That hasn't been super studied, so we don't know if that number is exactly correct, but a lot of lives have been saved by that money.
This is all about saving lives. There's no ambiguity here. Working with partners to ensure that all communities are healthy and strong, at least have a shot at being healthy and strong. That people everywhere can live in dignity. It's hard to maintain your dignity when you look at your child and see that they are sick or ill with a disease that you can't control. It's difficult, it shocks you, and it deprives you of your dignity. That's why the United States is proud to be a founding member of the Global Fund. And over the past 20 years, through our work together, it's estimated the Global Fund has saved, as you heard before, 50 million lives.
And again, that highlights something we've talked about 2 times on the show, and you've highlighted in the newsletter, which is the primary focus on what goes on in Washington is all the things that don't work, and the laws not passed, and Congress being broken and sclerotic, and nothing happens. And we talked to Eric Swalwell, congressman. We talked to Jeff Collier, former governor of Kansas. We talked to Bob Hertzberg, who was the outgoing Senate Majority Leader in California, to try to highlight, like, there are all these bills that are being passed all the time in a bipartisan fashion that we just don't pay attention to, mostly because they don't attract controversy. So you get this funding bill for something that most people agree is a good thing. And it doesn't get news because most people agree it's a good thing, and therefore it's not news. Because everyone agreed, no one fought, there weren't hyperbolic statements. They just decided this was something we need to spend money on, we need to support globally. There's a big consensus that this is something that we have the money for, that we should use the money for. And so we're going to spend it that way. All of which is great. But then it attracts no notice because it's sort of seen as uninteresting. And that's part of the problem.
It's too simple. There are no hard edges to sink our teeth into, but we're doing our best here on the podcast. So after that, the right to disconnect might be coming to Africa. So the right to disconnect, for people who don't know, it's the laws that are in place for employers not being able to contact employees after hours or on weekends.
It may be difficult for employers to call their employees after official working hours. Nandi Senator Samson Cherargei has introduced amendments to the Employment Act to protect employees from working beyond the stipulated 8 working hours or even calling them after hours. The move is, however, receiving strong opposition, with both the Central Organization of Trade Unions and the Federation of Kenya Employers warning that this could lead to job losses and scare away potential investors. But as Brenda Zeda Radido now reports, employees, on the other hand, have welcomed the proposed legislation.
Right now, France, Italy, Belgium, Spain, Ireland, and parts of Canada and Australia have enacted laws around this. And now Kenya is going to be the first African nation to discuss it. So Parliament is discussing it this month. We'll see if they pass anything. But I think most people listening to this would probably be in support.
Does this mean I won't be able to reach you now?
Well, Greece has not signed on. Also, we have a time zone difference going on, which makes things more difficult.
How is that going to work?
Okay.
Which hours will you have a right to disconnect from?
Actually, that's a really good. I didn't think about that in terms of remote work and how that functions. Let's say you're a French employee working outside of France. Can your French employer contact you? I don't know. I'll have to look into that.
Wow. It's a wrinkle. It's a disturbance in the force. What to do about remote work, globally disconnected time zones in a right to disconnect law? Okay, we're going to have to table that one for the time being. Things to think about going forward.
Yep. And another thing to think about going forward. So this is another trend, very much so on the early side. Switzerland is the only country so far that allows the therapeutic use of psilocybin, so the stuff that's in shrooms, the active ingredient in shrooms, and MDMA to treat depression for psilocybin and PTSD with MDMA. And they do it in a very limited fashion. And then people listening to the podcast probably know that Oregon in the US also has, they also allow that. Australia just became the next country to allow it.
MDMA and psilocybin, psychedelics found in magic mushrooms and ecstasy, are now set to be used on patients with mental health conditions across Australia.
This is a groundbreaking announcement by the TGA. They're really taking the initiative and leading the world.
A former Defence Force chief has been campaigning to use MDMA on veterans.
People I work with in my not-for-profit post-traumatic stress disorder Australia, New Zealand, tell me that the only way we will ever cure post-traumatic stress disorder in people is the use of psychedelic drugs.
Today's drug approval will only be prescribed to people with post-traumatic stress disorder and depression.
Starting in the summertime in 2023, psychiatrists will be able to prescribe MDMA and psilocybin. There's a lot of rules around that, and they're not sure how exactly it's all going to work. But they are, it seemed to me like there's a lot of surprise around Australia being essentially the first/second country to do this.
Yeah, I have to say, one of the things that's happened in my lifetime that has surprised me perhaps the most is how quickly attitudes about the legalization of formerly illegal drugs has moved culturally. I suppose that and kind of broad acceptance of gay marriage, right? The two things that seemed as late as the early 2000s to be a generation away from having any, major cultural change. And look, I'm not saying that as an advocate of everyone should go out and, take chocolate shrooms. It's from the perspective of most of these substances, whether they're legal substances like SSRIs or Valium or MDMA or mushrooms or acid or pot, they're all abusable and they're all usable. And they're usable from both sort of pleasurable reasons and they're usable for therapeutic reasons. And figuring out the risks and figuring out the uses is complicated and requires a lot of time, effort, hopefully with some degree of neutrality, meaning without a priori prejudice about where the study of those results will lead. I mean, that's an idealism that I know isn't happening anytime soon. Neutrality in the study of drug side effects is not something we're going to get to anytime soon. But at least it's an opening where we're both simultaneously scrutinizing drugs that are legal, that are FDA authorized, and taking a harder look at, are those things potentially harmful, even though they've been deemed helpful? And on the flip side, looking at things that we've thought were harmful and wondering if they could be helpful. And I think that, and a kind of a lessening of law enforcement and Puritanism and the amount of money and time that we spend creating an endless cycle of incarceration in the United States around the purveyance of, the use of, the selling of, drugs that are classified as illegal. I think all of that has been just a massively positive change. A lot more work to do, but still.
It's funny that you bring up the change, because I was just on a podcast, and the host was in his 50s or 60s, and I was talking about how I got into Buddhism, which happens to involve some use of psychedelics. And I said something like, nothing hard, just LSD, shrooms kind of thing. And he was like, well, in my day, that was a hard drug. And I was like, well, not anymore. I think like in my generation, for sure, it's just considered, it does have this flavor of like, it helps with psychiatric things. It's not considered to be that kind of hard drug anymore. And I'm very curious to see where this is going to go in the next 10, 20 years.
Right. And the trends clearly are to remove the state's use of power and violence to enforce a regime that criminalizes the use of these substances, which is very different than saying you should use them, right? The non-criminalization of alcohol is not an invocation of everyone should go drink. It's simply saying that this is not an area where the state should be involved and in creating cycles of crime and punishment around the use of them. So I think that's an incredibly positive development in the world today.
And
Huzzah.
Huzzah, and Australia sounds like it's being very careful about it for those who may be hearing this and worrying about it. But if you're an Australian, you may be able to ask your psychiatrist about it. So that's it for today.
We look forward to engaging all of you for the next months as we continue these conversations. We're certainly here for suggestions, so go onto the progressnetwork.org site, and if you want to send us ideas, in addition to signing up for the newsletter, in addition to listening to the podcast, we are, as they say, all ears.
We are listening to you guys and hope to hear from you. And thank you, Zachary.
Thanks, Emma. Until next time.